Okay. Hey, Erika, how are you?
Hey, Douglas, I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
Oh, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it. You are promoting your book. I see it back there behind you. Many copies, The Big Hurt.
Hmm.
Now, this is a memoir.
Yes, it's a straight up memoir that covers time periods, adolescence in the late 70s, early 80s, and then the second half of the book is middle age from around 2008, 9.
Normally, I don't dive straight into people's talking points that they have on their bios
Mm.
because I like to do a little introduction, but this seems appropriate. On the very first one, it says, "Why did you take 12 years to write this?"
Well, that's there's a few reasons for that. First of all, when I started writing this book, I wanted to continue my success as a humor writer. I had written a book in 2007, a memoir called You're Not the Boss of Me, Adventures of a Modern Mom. And I thought I would do the same, just write a sort of light and hilarious memoir about being packed off to a bohemian boarding school at the end of the 70s, where there was lots of fun and mischief and pranking and learning. And then at the end, sadly, I was seduced by a music teacher in the spring of my senior year and kicked out of the school. And I was going to figure out how to write around that. But as I started writing the book, I actually began to look at the story that I had been running away from. And when I looked at it, I just held it as anecdote. And I realized that, in fact, it was a really sad story. And that I had modeled myself as a bad girl my whole life because of this event. And it turned out that I wasn't a bad girl. I was just a hurt girl. And so I had to really, it took me a very long time to process that. And then on top of that, life events, which many of which are in the book, really slowed it down. I have two kids. I engaged in an affair with a lunatic drug addict. My parents became ill and died while I wrote this book. So it just life and the heaviness of the subject.
Wow, a lot of information there. Let's
Yeah.
see. Where do you want to start? Let me go back to that school. You said that this was a bohemian boarding school. Was this high school?
Yeah, it was. I grew up in New York City in Manhattan, and I went to a school called the Dalton School, which was a very prestigious school, whatever, in the city. And then because I was getting into mischief, my parents had a toxic divorce, and I was rebelling, as 13-year-olds are wont to do. And instead of holding me closer and keeping me safe, they pushed me away and they sent me off first to a summer job as an au pair in London for two very young girls, where I got picked up for shoplifting because I wanted to come home. And then instead of going home, they sent me to boarding school, where I thrived actually for 4 years until what happened at the end.
With the teacher, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And this was a school, it was a very tiny school. There were about 80 students when I was there, and 25 faculty and support staff. So it was a super close community, which was exactly what a girl far from home needed to have, right? And I made a lot of friends, and I really discovered myself as a writer and as an actress and as a thinker and as a social person. But one of the things that I learned in this school was that teacher-student relationships were normally condoned. I knew of a few liaisons while I was there that were very much in the vernacular of the school. Like everybody was aware of it and nobody really talked about it, but understood that it was happening. So by the time I was caught, I was sort of surprised that they were taking it so seriously. I thought it was okay to do, but what did I know?
How old were you?
And those events, I was about 2 months past my 18th birthday. I was 6 weeks from my senior graduation.
Okay, so
Um,
technically it was legal because you were of age, right?
Oh, yes. It was not a stat rape because I was 2 months past my 18th birthday, but also the school could not legally expel me because they were contractually responsible for me until graduation. But they told me, without the support of my parents being there, that it would be very upsetting for the teacher's wife, who was still teaching at the school, and for the students at the school if I were to be there through the rest of the year. So I sort of was disappeared from the school
Wow.
quietly and never heard anything from them again. You know, I went back for a couple of reunions early on in an attempt to sort of re-engage with my home and my family, which is what this school had been to me. But yeah, they never took responsibility for it.
How old was, I assume it was a man?
Yeah, he was 33 at the time. So, you know, I mean, it was a huge balance of power issue. You know, I mean, yeah, I was 2 months past my birthday, but I was technically still a child. And but just the whole thing was so shameful and hidden from view and scandalous. And I mean, I finished my high school career as a figure of scandal. And it was that that branded me for most of my life. You know, I carried that sort of label as a bad girl, or, you know, I've been labeled many things, as many women are, you know. When I was a kid, I was jailbait, you know, and then in that situation, I was the other woman, you know, and
Right.
then I went on to be a femme fatale, you know. I kept performing these roles, being assigned these roles by dint of my gender and my vulnerability. And in the end, I ended up carrying the weight of that through my adult life. And the big hurt is my reckoning with that.
So the book was therapeutic for you, I hope.
Yes, I mean, therapy was also therapeutic for me. And I did everything I could. I mean, so just so you understand what happened, as I began to try to write The Big Hurt, which at first was simply called Unsupervised, um, I had become, I had been introduced to a man out here in Los Angeles at the LA Times Festival of Books, of a sort of infamous Lothario and noir writer. And I became fascinated with him. I had never read any of his books, of course, but when I met him, I recognized him. It's like something deep in my soul. And our courtship, I mean, I met him once and then I didn't meet him again for another year, and then not again for another year after that. So as my marriage was devolving and I was becoming more and more miserable and lost in myself, I became obsessed with him. And then finally in 2009, as Facebook was flourishing and people were reconnecting and connecting like mad on that platform, I friended him. And he came back to me with a love letter that was bonkers. And so something in my subconscious at that time, I now know now, decided that it would be easier for me to blow up my marriage and my family and engage a love affair with this known crazy person. That would be easier than really going back and looking what happened to me. And there's a word for this. There's a term for this in psychology. It's called repetition compulsion. And that was a classic case. My subconscious drove me into the arms of this man so that I could work through what had happened to me as a teenager.
So the guy that you were just talking about, was he similar in personality to the music teacher?
No, not at all. Other than that, he was an older, inappropriate, pedagogic male. I mean, and we came together. The excuse for us at the beginning was that he was going to help me with my book because he was an author of many large, complicated historical novels, and I had only written essays. I had no idea how to write a full-length book. So we sort of set it up as a mentor-mentee relationship that we worked on for several weeks, and then it devolved into a romantic attachment.
Yeah, how long did that go on?
On and off for 4 years. We were together for 4 years. And, he is a wounded narcissist and love bombed me and projected all over me. And, I did the same for him, of course, and I'm never not guilty in this book of my own actions. And then, the relationship, he was deeply paranoid and he fell back into the drug addiction he had conquered in his youth. And the whole relationship just devolved horribly. And I ended up having my heart broken again in very much the same way I had back in 1982 when I was expelled from the school I loved. And I went and lived with the teacher for 6 weeks. And then he dumped me in a really brutal fashion that sort of shot me into a period, about a decade of heartbreak and mourning and loss. And I always thought it was the teacher I was mourning. And it turned out it wasn't. It was my mother, And that's what the title is about. We carry this hurt in us where we lacked love as children as we formed our identities, and we carry it with us until we finally face it and resolve it.
What did your parents say when they found out about the music teacher?
My father was furious, enraged, wouldn't talk to me. And my mother, from whom I had been estranged, I was estranged from her most of my life, on and off, from the time I reached puberty until the day she died. But in that instance, she was open arms. She was wholly accepting and understanding and drew me to her bosom. And the reason why was because when she was a student at Sarah Lawrence College in the 50s, she had been drawn into a very strange, dark, and lengthy love affair with her professor, a professor of psychology, and his wife. And she formed a weird sexual triad with them that ended up warping her and hurting her to a point that by the time she had me, she was lost to her own hurt. And I was raised by a woman with just such a deep ache and so much resentment. And I never could understand it as a kid. Of course, I took it all personally. And it's only now that I have gone through what I've gone through that I understand that in part I was carrying her shame.
Do you have kids?
I do. I have 2 kids. Both were assigned female at birth. The eldest is now non-binary. But at the time I was writing it, to my knowledge, I had 2 girls and I am the eldest of 2 girls. So as I was writing the book, I was seeing my own childhood being sort of reflected and repeated through them. And it really brought into sharp focus, what had happened. Just seeing both of my parents with my kids, I think any parent can relate to that, having children and seeing your parents with them is almost like a diorama of your own childhood. It really unlocks a lot of stuff. I was just trying to avoid the mistakes my parents made, which largely I did, but I made others.
How is your relationship with your kids? How old are they now?
They're both in their early 20s.
When they were growing up, did you see parallels between, like you envisioned yourself as your mother making the same mistakes and consciously trying not to?
I was very unconscious until my eldest child was 5 years old. And then I read a book called The Drama of the Gifted Child, which I cannot recommend more to anyone. It's an old book, but it's a really brilliant look at how, basically how narcissists are made and then pass the wound on to their kids. And I understood that I was repeating some of the things my mother had done with me, with my children, because that was the only example of parenting I'd ever been given. And at that moment that I read that book, I stopped. I stopped exercising any anger around them that might make me feel good or that would frighten them or scare them. All of that stuff I stopped. And I was also fortunate to have my kids enrolled in a really beautiful humanistic preschool at the time when they were little. So we all learned a lot of lessons about how to be with each other that have served us so far really, really well. And the love between us is very solid. You
Oh,
know,
that's good to
life is
hear.
complicated, but we are good.
I'm glad to hear that because sometimes it does carry over from generation to generation. I know I've
Yeah.
had issues with my mother similarly.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And it's like it's in the air we breathe growing up. You know, we don't understand our parents as complex individuals with their own histories and their own hurts, but we absorb the example of it. Um, and I know I felt that every day with my mother, you know, that she was just always on the thin edge of anger or despair. And it made me so hesitant my whole life growing up and feel like I was always guilty of something. And then when all that feeling got compounded by my experiences at boarding school. So, you know, by the time I was ready to launch into the world, you know, I was a hot mess.
Well, I think on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. Do you have a website that you want to give out, personal one or one for the book?
I do. It's Erika Schickel. So just all you need to do is spell my name correctly. Erika with a K, SCHICKEL.com. Or just Google The Big Hurt and you'll probably get led to my website. Or you can find me at Chickadee on Instagram, or Erika Schickel on Twitter, or Erika Schickel on Facebook.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing